Major Garrett, our chief White House correspondent, is joining us now from Washington. Major, the secretary was just talking about next steps and a steering committee that the foreign minister mentioned. What is that?
Well, it's a place where you can, meaning the two nations, try to sort out the remaining differences, which are many. And this is now the next stage of diplomatic relations. A lot of words that may or may not mean anything. Sometimes diplomacy is full of words that are completely empty, that mean nothing at all, and don't suggest any advancement of relations or narrowing of differences. The big test for the United States and Cuba will be not words, because things have now taken on a life of their own as far as relationships. They are now open, joined, they're normalized. What do you do with them? What are the priorities of the United States? And what actions will it demand of the Cuban government in order to advance relationships between the two countries? And look, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, just made mention that the Obama administration would like the trade embargo, first set in motion by President Kennedy, reinforced by Congresses over the decades and through the 90s, tightened very much, should be lifted. There's only one way that's going to happen, is if the Republican Congress, House and Senate, see significant changes on behalf of the Castro regime in Cuba to fundamentally change the relationship it has to the people who live there, allowing more press freedom, allowing more dissent, and not jailing and beating people for the simple act of opposing the government. Until that happens, the trade embargo will likely remain, and it's going to be up to this administration to drive that human rights agenda more aggressively than it has in these early hours. You just saw the Secretary of State, John Kerry, sort of dance around that, talking about diplomats in Havana being able to meet people of all different kinds. What does that mean? Look, the people that the United States is most interested in talking to in Cuba are the dissidents, are those whose political rights and freedoms have been systematically limited by the Castro government. And if you're not going to identify those people early on as high priorities of the U.S. government, then that issue may not be getting the attention it needs, and it's certainly not getting the attention most Republicans in Congress would expect.
Let's talk about those dissidents. They weren't exactly invited to the flag raising at the U.S. Embassy today.
As I understand it, they were prohibited by the Cuban government, and that's a concession that the United States made in order to make sure that this would be carried off with minimal rancor. That may have been a wise decision in this moment. You don't want to infect a moment like this with unnecessary confrontation. However, it's also a signal to the Cuban government that it can dictate terms as it sees fit, and the United States, at least initially, is willing to accept certain limitations. If those limitations continue, the United States government is going to have some explaining to do with the Republican-led Congress, because many Republicans want to see how this issue will play out. And they're not interested in steering groups or committees or task forces. They're interested in the United States government identifying people whose rights have been trampled upon, asking the Cuban government to take specific actions, and elevating that whole issue higher than it's been elevated so far. So this is a work in progress, clearly, but it doesn't do enough for the White House to say we'd like the embargo to be lifted. It's going to have to go through a Republican-led Congress, and for that to happen, some significant changes have to be either promised or at least moved in the direction of.
So what can the president do by executive action? Everything leading up to this point has been done by executive action. So the Congress is saying, look, we are not going to lift that embargo. It's not going to happen. The president can't do it himself. But what can he do going forward to continue what he would like to call bettering the relationship with Cuba?
One more move. Nominate an ambassador, and then ask the Senate to confirm whoever that person is. Jeff De Laurentiis, who was a part of the ceremonial flag raising today, preceded John Kerry to the podium, is the charge d'affaires in Havana right now. The top American diplomat, has been integral to this entire diplomatic process of normalizing relations, very experienced in Cuba, knows all the key players. He would be a likely person to nominate. But that's the next step the president can take, and it's the only thing he's got left to do. Every other bit of executive power he has already set in motion. This is now entirely the future of this relationship, and whether or not the embargo is lifted or not and other steps are taken has to go through the United States Congress, because it is duly enacted law, and only Congress can change the law on the books.
So let's talk about that. Let's say Obama nominates the gentleman you just mentioned. Has Congress signaled that they intend to confirm someone?
Quite the opposite. The Republican-led Senate has suggested that it doesn't matter who President Obama nominates, Jeff De Laurentiis or anybody else. Doesn't matter what their capabilities are, doesn't matter what their diplomatic past is and likely future is. No matter how qualified he or she might be, they're not interested because they oppose this policy. They believe it's a bad idea. Now, that could all be rhetoric. If there is a nomination and that person has substantial qualifications for the job and this dialogue and process continues, things may change in the United States Senate. But the opening bid from the Republican-led Senate is, it doesn't matter who you nominate, that person will not be confirmed. That's a very tough, aggressive opening bit of rhetoric. I'm not sure it will last, but there's only one way to find out. The president has to take the step of nominating someone to be the first U.S. ambassador to Cuba under this new normalized relationship.
Major, the U.S. says there are people in Cuba that the Cuban government is protecting. People the U.S. says are criminals, and they want back to face justice.
Yes.
What's the likelihood of that happening?
It all depends on how much the administration makes that a priority and how willingness the Cuban government is to offer these people back up as concessions. I think this is going to be a very difficult issue for a couple of reasons. One, the Cubans took these Americans in. I think the number is slightly more than 40. They are not convicted in most respects. I don't believe any of them are actually convicts. They are either escapees or people who tried to flee the process of being subjected to American justice. Cuba welcomed them, excuse me, as political refugees or political prisoners because the Cuban government believes the United States legal system is fundamentally unjust. Of course, there's a lot of irony there because that's exactly what the United States believes of the Cuban judicial system, that it is fundamentally unjust. So these Americans who left the United States, fled to Cuba, have been protected, given exile and safety, and in many instances, homes, not lavish homes, but they have been taken care of as political prisoners and as symbols of Cuba's hostility to America. To get them back into America, to face justice, that's all the United States is asking for. Extradite them so they can go through the criminal process, have a trial, have evidence presented, and see what happens. For the Cubans to be willing to do that, they're probably going to ask for something in return, which will make the negotiations all the more complex. This will not be an easy one to resolve.
Major Garrett, our chief White House correspondent, thank you, sir.
You got it.